My name is Isabella Martinez, and I'm 29 years old. I never thought my accent, something that carried pieces of my heritage, my roots, and my family's sacrifices, would one day be used against me in a conference room full of polished executives. I always knew corporate America wasn't built for people like me, but I thought if I worked hard enough, spoke with confidence, and delivered results, people would see me for my abilities, not the way I rolled my R's or stretched certain vowels. I was wrong. The company I worked for wasn't small. It was one of those multinational firms where everyone strutted around in tailored suits, clutching expensive coffees, pretending they weren't exhausted. I had worked there for 5 years, climbing rung by rung with everything I had. I had started as an intern, back when I couldn't even afford a car, and took 2 buses just to make it to the office on time. I remembered sitting at my desk, highlighting contracts, double-checking numbers, and writing notes no one asked me to write, just so I wouldn't mess anything up. My parents had always said, "You'll have to work twice as hard for half the recognition." They were right, but I was determined. By 29, I had made it to project manager. My division handled international clients, which meant language barriers, cultural nuances, and negotiations that required not just brains, but empathy. That was my strength. I could read people, connect with them, and bridge gaps others couldn't. And that's why I knew my boss, Richard, Mr. Perfect Hair, Harvard MBA, blindingly white smile, hated me. He saw me as competition. Richard was the type of man who never let anyone forget his credentials. He introduced himself with them, sprinkled them into conversations like seasoning, and used them as a shield when clients doubted him. He had charm, but it was shallow. He was slick where I was steady, and where I cared, he calculated. He once told me in a private meeting, "Isabella, you're good with clients, but you lack polish. You need to sound more professional." I knew exactly what he meant. My accent. My voice.
Me.
I tried to brush it off, but it stung. I had worked so hard to be here, yet to him, my presence wasn't enough. That sting turned into fire the day he mocked me. It was a Thursday morning. We had flown out to Chicago for a high-stakes meeting with a new European client. They were considering investing millions with us. The board had trusted Richard to lead the presentation, but I had been the one preparing the materials, analyzing their needs, and drafting the solutions we would pitch. When the meeting started, I sat across from the clients, flipping open my binder, feeling the usual rush of nerves that came before I spoke. I delivered my part with precision. I explained market projections, outlined strategies, and even cracked a small joke about cultural missteps in branding. The clients laughed warmly, leaning in. I could see their interest deepen. For a moment, I felt proud, confident. And then it happened. One of the clients asked a clarifying question. I answered smoothly, but as I did, Richard suddenly repeated my words, mocking the way I pronounced them. He exaggerated my accent, rolling the syllables in a cartoonish way. The room froze. The clients shifted uncomfortably. One even raised his eyebrows. My face burned, heat crawling up my neck. I wanted to disappear. Richard laughed, trying to play it off as humor, but I could see in the clients' eyes that they didn't find it funny. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was cruel. I sat there, hands folded so tightly my knuckles went white, forcing myself to stay still. If I said something then, I risked being labeled emotional or difficult. If I stayed silent, I let him strip me of dignity in front of people who mattered. I chose silence, at least in that moment. But inside, I shattered. Every insecurity I had ever carried, the years of classmates mocking me in school, the times I had overheard whispers in college about the Latina girl in business school, they all rushed back like a tidal wave. I heard my mother's voice reminding me, "Your accent is not a weakness. It is proof you are bilingual, proof of intelligence." But Richard's voice was louder in that room. When the meeting ended, the clients shook hands, their smiles polite but stiff. I could feel the damage. Richard slapped my back like we were teammates and said, "See? Lighten up, Isabella. They love us." I went back to my hotel room that night and cried. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the city lights, wondering if maybe I didn't belong in this world after all. Maybe I would always be the outsider, The one good enough to do the work but never polished enough to stand in the spotlight. But as I wiped my tears, something inside me hardened.
No.
I wasn't going to let Richard define me. Not after everything I had sacrificed. Not after the years of pushing myself through doubt and exhaustion. I didn't know it then, but that moment, my humiliation, my anger, my silence, would become the spark that set everything else in motion. Because the board wasn't blind. And Richard's arrogance wasn't invisible. The very thing he thought would bring me down would end up lifting me higher than I ever imagined. The next morning, when I walked back into the office after our trip, I could already feel the shift. People looked at me a little longer than usual. Conversations that had once stopped when I walked by now seemed to carry on in hushed tones. And though no one said it outright, I knew word had gotten around about what happened in Chicago. It's funny how quickly humiliation travels in corporate corridors. Faster than emails, faster than memos. One whisper, one half-told story, and suddenly, you're not Isabella, the project manager who saved 3 client contracts last quarter. You're Isabella, the girl whose boss made fun of her accent. I kept my head high, or at least I tried to. I wore my best navy blazer, tied my hair back in a sleek ponytail, and walked into meetings as though I belonged there. But inside, I was unraveling. Every time I opened my mouth, I wondered if people were listening to my ideas or just to the way I spoke. Every sentence felt like a test I was destined to fail. And then came the meeting with the regional team. Richard was in his element, cracking jokes, exaggerating stories, doing everything but real work. At one point, when I offered a suggestion, he cut me off with a smirk and said, "Well, if our clients can understand you, I'm sure they'll agree." The room chuckled nervously. My cheeks burned. This wasn't just a one-time mistake. He was making it a pattern. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with takeout containers scattered around me, staring at my reflection in the black screen of my laptop. I thought about my father, who had worked in construction for 30 years, his hands calloused and back bent, so I could go to school. I thought about my mother, who used to correct my English when I was little but always kissed my forehead afterward, reminding me, "Mija, don't erase where you come from. Carry it with pride." And I thought about me, 29 years old, drowning in student loans, surviving on caffeine, and spending sleepless nights polishing presentations that Richard took credit for. Was this what all those sacrifices were for? To sit at a table and be humiliated because my words didn't sound like his? The anger began to simmer into something sharper, resolve. The next day, I decided I wouldn't hide anymore. If Richard wanted to paint me as unpolished, then I would show the board just how unpolished results looked. I poured myself into work like never before. Every chart, every projection, every client memo, I made sure it was airtight. And when clients responded positively, I quietly noted who they praised in their emails. Spoiler, it wasn't Richard. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, as I was walking to grab coffee, one of the senior partners, a woman named Elaine, stopped me in the hallway. She was intimidating, sharp suits, sharper words, the kind of woman who could silence a room with one look. "Isabella," she said, her eyes scanning me like a report she was reviewing. "I heard what happened in Chicago." My stomach dropped. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but she raised a hand. "I also heard how you handled it. You stayed composed. That takes strength." For a second, I just blinked at her, unsure if this was a compliment or a setup. Then she added, "You know, clients talk. They liked you. They noticed your preparation. Don't let one man's insecurity convince you otherwise." And then she walked away, heels clicking like a metronome down the hall. Her words lit a fire in me. If Elaine, someone at her level, saw value in what I had done, maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe Richard wasn't invincible. Over the next week, I noticed little cracks forming in his armor. He was late to meetings. He brushed off details that clients asked for. He snapped at analysts when reports weren't perfect. The charm that once dazzled seemed thinner, stretched too far. And behind closed doors, people were starting to whisper, not about me, but about him. Still, every time he mocked me, it cut deep. At a Friday wrap-up meeting, he mimicked me again, drawing out my words as if I were a comedy sketch. This time, I caught Elaine's eyes across the table. She wasn't laughing. Neither were half the others. And that's when I realized something. Richard wasn't hurting me anymore. He was hurting himself. That weekend, I sat with my journal, scribbling furiously. I wrote down every client I had helped retain, every project where my analysis had saved money, every presentation I had built from scratch. It wasn't vanity, it was proof. Proof that I belonged here. Proof that I was more than the way I spoke. But I also wrote down something else. How I felt. The shame. The rage. The quiet moments of doubt. I poured it all onto the page because I knew one day I would need those words. Not just for me, but for the moment I finally stood up, not in silence, not in shame, but in truth. What I didn't know yet was how soon that moment would come. Because while I was busy strengthening myself, the board was already watching. And Richard was giving them every reason to choose someone else. By the third week after Chicago, the air around the office felt different. Richard still strutted down the hallways with his Harvard arrogance and his blinding smile, but the shine was dimming. He had always been quick with a joke, but now, people laughed less. His comments about me, my accent, my lack of polish, landed with uncomfortable silence. And in the silence, I saw something shift. People were no longer entertained. They were embarrassed for him. I clung to that shift like a lifeline. For years, I had felt like an outsider, bending over backward to prove I deserved a seat at the table. Now, for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, the cracks were showing in someone else's armor, not mine. But I knew better than to relax. One wrong move, and I'd be the one falling through those cracks. So, I doubled down on my work. Every morning, I arrived earlier than Richard. I stayed later. I combed through reports, refining data until the numbers told a story no one could question. I rehearsed presentations in my tiny apartment, pacing the floor, forcing myself to hear the sound of my own voice without flinching. I needed to get comfortable with it again, my accent, my cadence, the rhythm of my speech. I reminded myself, this voice had closed deals. This voice had comforted clients, solved problems, and built relationships across borders. Richard could mock it, but he couldn't erase the results. One morning, I walked into a board prep meeting. Richard was supposed to lead, but as usual, he was unprepared. He flipped through slides I had created, barely skimming them before clearing his throat. We'll, circle back to this later, he mumbled, brushing past key points. My stomach clenched. This wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was recklessness. Elaine sat at the end of the table, watching closely. I could feel her eyes flicking between Richard and me, like she was taking notes in her mind. Finally, she cut in. Richard, what's our projected client retention if we follow your strategy? He hesitated. His jaw tightened. He glanced at me. Isabella has the numbers, he said, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. I swallowed hard, then spoke. My voice was steady, my accent clear but firm. Projected retention is 86% with this approach. If we incorporate localized adjustments, I tapped the slide, we can push closer to 91%. That's based on historical patterns in comparable markets. The room went quiet, the weight of the data settling. Elaine leaned back, folding her arms. And for the first time, no one looked at Richard. They looked at me. After the meeting, Richard cornered me in the hallway. His smile was gone, his voice low and sharp. You're making me look bad. I didn't flinch. You're doing that yourself. For a moment, I thought he might explode. His face reddened, his jaw clenched, but then he smirked, that fake charm returning like a mask. Careful, Isabella. Don't forget who runs this team. I walked away without answering, but inside, I burned. He was losing control, and he knew it. That made him dangerous. The danger revealed itself days later, when a client dinner loomed. A high-profile European firm was flying in, and Richard insisted on leading. Stick to the numbers, Isabella, he told me before we left. Leave the relationship building to me. They'll appreciate someone polished. The words dug under my skin, but I bit my tongue. That night, as we sat around the long white tablecloth, Richard poured on his charm. Too much of it. He bragged about his Harvard years, his golf trips, his network. The clients smiled politely, but I could see their interest fading. When one asked about regional market adaptability, Richard floundered, fumbling through vague answers. Finally, one of them turned to me. "What do you think, Ms. Martinez?" I felt every eye at the table on me. My heart pounded. I could almost hear Richard's voice in my head. "Don't embarrass me." I inhaled deeply and answered. Slowly. Clearly. I explained the nuances, how cultural differences impacted brand reception, how small adjustments could make or break campaigns. I gave examples from real cases I had managed. By the time I finished, the clients were nodding, leaning forward again. One of them even smiled. "You understand us. That's rare." Richard laughed a little too loudly. "Of course she does, she's got the unique perspective." His tone dripped with sarcasm, the unspoken jab about my accent hanging heavy in the air. But this time, the clients didn't laugh with him. They frowned. One exchanged a look with another, unimpressed. That night, I lay in bed replaying every moment. Richard's mockery, their silence, my words. And for the first time since Chicago, I felt something other than shame. I felt power. Not because I had humiliated him, but because I had refused to let him humiliate me. A week later, I was called into a private meeting with Elaine and 2 other board members. My stomach twisted as I sat down, half convinced I was in trouble. But Elaine's first words caught me off guard. "We've been watching," she said simply. "We know what Richard has been doing." My chest tightened. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but she raised a hand. "You don't need to explain. The clients have spoken louder than either of you. They trust you. They respect you. And frankly, so do we." I sat there, stunned, barely able to breathe. Richard thought mocking my accent would bury me. What he didn't realize was that he had just dug his own grave. After that meeting with Elaine and the other board members, I walked back to my desk in a daze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. They respected me. They trusted me. Words I had been chasing for years were finally spoken, and yet, they didn't bring the relief I thought they would. Instead, they lit a fuse. Because if the board was watching, then everything I did next mattered more than ever. Richard must have felt it too, because his behavior grew more erratic. He barked at interns for tiny mistakes. He snapped at analysts who asked clarifying questions. And when it came to me, the mockery doubled. He wasn't just targeting my accent anymore, he began questioning my intelligence. One morning, during a status update with our team, I presented a streamlined plan for a client rollout. Richard cut me off with a sneer. "That's cute, Isabella. But let's hear a real solution." The room fell silent. My throat tightened, but before I could reply, one of the junior associates spoke up. "Actually, her plan saves us 15% in costs." I ran the numbers. Richard froze. His smile faltered. He quickly brushed it off, moving to the next topic, but I caught the look in his eyes. He knew he was losing control of the narrative. His authority was slipping, and every time he tried to undermine me, others saw through it. At night, though, the old doubts crept in. I'd sit on my couch, staring at my laptop, wondering if I could really handle the pressure. If I was strong enough to withstand not just Richard, but the weight of all the expectations now placed on me. I thought of my parents again, my father telling me stories of working 2 shifts so I could afford books, my mother staying up late to help me with homework even though English wasn't her first language. I realized I wasn't just carrying myself in those boardrooms. I was carrying them too. The breaking point came 2 weeks later at a quarterly review with the full board. Richard insisted on leading the presentation. He strutted into the room, flashing his smile, his suit immaculate. I followed with my binder, notes meticulously prepared, though I wasn't sure I'd even get a chance to speak. The first half went as expected. Richard performed. He cracked jokes, he dazzled, he paced the room like a showman. But the cracks showed fast. His slides were vague. His numbers were off. When one of the board members asked about projections, he stumbled, muttering excuses about having the data somewhere in the back. Then, Elaine turned to me. Isabella, do you have those numbers? The moment stretched. Every eye was on me. I stood, my palms damp, but my voice steady. I outlined the figures clearly, showing where costs could be cut, where revenue streams could expand. My accent carried through the room, unapologetic, steady as a drumbeat. By the time I finished, the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was powerful. One board member leaned forward. That's exactly the clarity we've been looking for. Richard's jaw tightened. He forced a laugh. Yes, well, Isabella's great with the small details. But it was too late. They weren't looking at him anymore.
They were looking at me.
Afterward, as we left the room, Richard pulled me aside, his grip on my arm just a little too tight. His smile was plastered on, but his voice was venom. Don't think this means anything. You're just a convenient face. A trend. They'll move on. I yanked my arm free. Or maybe they're done with empty suits and want someone who actually delivers. For the first time since I'd known him, Richard didn't have a comeback. He just glared, his mask slipping, rage simmering beneath the surface. Over the next week, whispers spread. I heard that some of the board members were meeting privately. Rumors swirled that Richard's position wasn't as secure as it once had been. His allies were dwindling. And while he kept mocking me in public, I noticed the laughter was gone.
People weren't with him anymore. They were just tolerating him.
It was strange, though. I didn't feel triumphant yet. I felt cautious, like a runner in the last stretch of a marathon, legs burning, lungs on fire, knowing the finish line was close but terrified of stumbling before crossing it. One night, after a long day, I sat at my desk long after everyone else had gone home. The office was dark, the city lights glowing through the windows. I pulled out my journal, flipping back to the page I had written weeks ago after Chicago, the page where I had poured out all my shame, my anger, my doubts. I read it slowly, my chest tightening, remembering the girl who had sat on her hotel bed believing she wasn't enough. I closed the journal and whispered to myself, never again. Because now I knew the truth. Richard hadn't broken me. He had revealed me. And the board had seen it too. The following Monday, I got the email. The board had called an emergency meeting. Richard was being reviewed for conduct unbecoming of a leader. And they wanted me to present directly to them about our division's future strategy. I stared at the screen, hardly able to believe it. My chance. My moment. Richard had tried to silence me with mockery. But now, the board was asking me to speak louder than ever. The day of the emergency board meeting, the air in the office was electric. People whispered in corners, hushed voices trailing off as I walked by. I knew they were talking about it, about me, about Richard, about what was about to unfold. My stomach was tight, my palms damp, but underneath the nerves there was a steel I hadn't felt before. This was my moment. When I walked into the boardroom, the atmosphere was heavier than usual. The long mahogany table gleamed under the overhead lights, water glasses lined up, notepads waiting. Richard was already there, leaning back in his chair with his trademark smirk, but I noticed something. It didn't reach his eyes. They were hard, cold, calculating. Elaine sat at the head of the table, her gaze steady. "Thank you both for coming," she said, her voice carrying authority. "We've convened this meeting because concerns have been raised about leadership within this division. Richard, as current head, you'll present your vision first. Isabella, you'll follow with your strategy. The board will deliberate afterward." Richard stood, smoothing his suit jacket. He launched into his presentation with his usual flair, big words, bigger promises, slides filled with buzzwords and glossy images. He spoke about synergy and scaling global potential, but the more he talked, the more it sounded like fluff. He skipped over numbers, glossed past specifics, and when pressed, deflected. I watched the board members' faces. Neutral at first, then skeptical, then unimpressed. By the time he wrapped up with, "And that's why I believe I'm the best to continue leading this division into the future," the room was silent. Not the good kind of silence. The kind that says, "We're not buying it." Elaine nodded curtly. "Thank you, Richard." "Isabella?" I stood. My knees trembled, but I forced my spine straight. I walked to the screen, my binder in hand, and looked around the room. My accent was there, steady and unapologetic. "Good morning," I began. "When I joined this company 5 years ago, I came with one goal: to prove I could contribute. Not because I had a perfect resume, but because I had drive. And over these 5 years, I've learned that what matters most isn't polish. It's results. It's relationships. It's trust." I clicked to the first slide.
Clean.
Data-driven.
Clear.
I walked them through the numbers. Retention rates, market expansion potential, client satisfaction metrics. I showed exactly how our division had outperformed expectations, projects I had managed, deals I had salvaged, innovations I had spearheaded. But I didn't stop there. I told stories about the European client who nearly walked until I sat down with them and listened, about the Latin American partnership where cultural sensitivity turned negotiations around, about the interns and analysts who flourished when given a voice at the table. "This isn't just about profit margins," I said, my voice firm. "It's about leadership that values every person, every background, every strength. It's about seeing what others overlook. That's how we win clients. That's how we keep them." When I finished, I let the silence hang. This time, it wasn't heavy. It was alive. The board members nodded, some even smiling faintly. One leaned forward. "That's the clarity and depth we've been asking for." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Well, sure, Isabella's good with the emotional side of things, but let's not mistake sentiment for strategy." Elaine cut him off. "What Isabella presented is strategy. Effective strategy." I felt my chest tighten, not with fear, but with relief. With vindication. The meeting adjourned shortly after, but as I gathered my things, Richard stormed over. His smile was gone. "You think you've won? You don't understand how this game works. They'll never choose you. You're a diversity token. A symbol. That's all you'll ever be." For a moment, his words stung. But then I remembered the boardroom, remembered their faces, their nods, their respect. I straightened. "No," I said quietly. "I'm proof you can't fake results forever." I walked out before he could reply, my heels clicking against the polished floor like punctuation marks. That evening, I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat on my balcony overlooking the city. The skyline glittered, alive with energy, and I thought about how far I had come. From the girl who took 2 buses to her internship, to the woman standing before a board, commanding their attention not despite her voice, but with it. But I also knew this wasn't over. The board would deliberate. Richard would fight. And the final decision hadn't been made yet. Still, deep down, I felt it, the tide had turned. The very thing Richard tried to use to break me, my accent, my roots, my difference, had become the reason the board listened. I didn't know what their decision would be yet. But for the first time, I believed I deserved whatever came next. And I was ready. The weekend before the board's final decision was the longest of my life. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, half expecting an email, half dreading it. I walked around my apartment restless, cleaning counters that were already spotless, pacing from the balcony to the couch to my desk. What if Richard was right? What if I was just a symbol, someone they used to make themselves look progressive before handing the real power back to him?
The thought gnawed at me.
But then I remembered Elaine's voice during the meeting, calm and decisive. What Isabella presented as strategy. That wasn't tokenism. That was recognition. By Monday morning, rumors were everywhere. Some said Richard was lobbying privately with board members. Others whispered he was trying to pin recent losses on me. I kept my head down, pouring into my work like I always had. Numbers don't lie, I told myself. Let him spin his stories. I had the results. That afternoon, I was called into Elaine's office. The view behind her desk stretched across the city, skyscrapers cutting into the clouds. She motioned for me to sit. "Richard has been persistent," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But the board sees through it. They see you." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "So, what happens next?" She studied me for a moment. "We'll announce our decision on Friday. In the meantime, I suggest you keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Delivering." I nodded. though my heart pounded. For more days of waiting. For more days of holding my breath. Richard, on the other hand, was unraveling. He cornered me in the hallway later that week, his smile strained, his voice low. "You think you've won, don't you? But let me tell you something, Isabella, accents fade. Charm doesn't. When this is over, you'll still be the outsider." I met his eyes, my pulse quickening. For years, his words would have gutted me.
But now?
Now they sounded hollow, like a man clinging to a rope that was already snapping. "Maybe," I said evenly, "but outsiders get things done. And the board knows it." I walked away before he could answer, my heels clicking on the marble floor like tiny gongs of defiance. Friday came. The boardroom was packed, tension so thick it felt like we were all breathing soup. Richard sat across from me, his jaw tight, his hands clasped like he was praying. Elaine stood at the head of the table, a folder in her hand. She scanned the room, then spoke. "After careful review, the board has made its decision regarding leadership in this division." The air stilled. "Richard, we appreciate your years of service, but your conduct has not aligned with the values or expectations of this firm. Effective immediately, your role as head of the division is terminated." A stunned silence fell. Richard's face went pale, then red, then pale again. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but Elaine continued without pausing. "Isabella Martinez will assume leadership of the division." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words didn't feel real.
Me.
Leading. The girl who had once taken 2 buses just to sit in a cubicle. The girl mocked for her voice. The girl who had cried in a Chicago hotel room believing she wasn't enough. Now I was enough. More than enough. Applause broke out from some corners of the room. Others sat stunned, but it didn't matter. All I could hear was my heartbeat and Elaine's final words. "We look forward to your vision, Isabella." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His smile was gone, replaced by a scowl that twisted his perfect features. "This is a mistake," he snapped. "You'll regret this." But no one answered. No one defended him. He stormed out, the door slamming behind him. I sat there, hands trembling slightly under the table, trying to steady myself. I had dreamed of moments like this, but never like this, not with so much weight, so much pain behind it. Yet maybe that's why it mattered. When the meeting adjourned, people came up to congratulate me. Some offered polite handshakes, others warm smiles. But the one that stayed with me was Elaine. She clasped my hand firmly and said, "You earned this. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That night, I walked home under the city lights, the air crisp against my skin. For the first time in years, I felt tall, not because of the title, but because of what it represented. Every sacrifice, every doubt, every sneer I had endured had led me here. Richard thought mocking my accent would break me. Instead, it revealed me. And in the end, it revealed him too. Empty, shallow, replaceable.
Me?
I was irreplaceable. But this story wasn't over yet. Because stepping into leadership meant more than just winning against Richard. It meant proving, day after day, that I could transform this division into something stronger, fairer, more human. And I was ready. My first day as head of the division didn't feel like the movies. There was no dramatic walk into the office with music swelling, no shower of confetti or champagne popping in the break room.
It was quieter than that.
More personal. I unlocked my new office, the one Richard had sat in for years, and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of leather and coffee. His things were gone, but his presence lingered like a ghost. I walked around the desk, tracing my fingers along the polished wood, remembering the times I had stood on the other side of it, waiting for his smirk, his dismissive tone, his subtle jabs.
Now it was my desk.
My chair. My responsibility. I sat down, opened my laptop, and pulled out the notes I had scribbled in my journal weeks earlier, the proof I had written for myself when I doubted everything. I smiled faintly. Those words, written in tears and anger, had carried me here. By mid-morning, the team trickled in to congratulate me. Some were enthusiastic, offering hugs and warm smiles. Others were cautious, Their loyalty still caught between the old regime and the new.
I didn't hold it against them.
Trust takes time. In the weeks that followed, I made changes. Small ones at first. I insisted analysts present their own work in meetings instead of funneling everything through managers. I created open forums for interns to pitch ideas. I set clear standards. Results mattered, but so did respect. There would be no more mocking, no more belittling, no more silencing. The first time a client complimented me directly as the reason we trust this firm, I felt my throat tighten. Not because of the praise itself, but because it wasn't about Richard anymore.
It was about me.
About my work, my voice, my accent. I carried those moments like armor. Of course, Richard didn't disappear quietly. I heard whispers he was trying to land elsewhere, but his reputation followed him. Clients talk. Boards listen. The man who once strutted through our halls like he owned them was now a cautionary tale. A reminder that arrogance, without substance, eventually collapses. Meanwhile, I built something new. Slowly, the division shifted. People spoke more freely. Laughter in meetings wasn't forced or awkward. It was genuine. When clients visited, they didn't just hear polished jargon. They heard authenticity. And they liked it. Late one night, months into my new role, I found myself once again alone in the office. The city lights glittered outside the tall windows, casting long reflections across the floor. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted but content, and thought about the journey. I thought about that humiliating moment in Chicago, the way Richard had twisted my words, turned my voice into a weapon against me. I thought about sitting on that hotel bed, convinced I wasn't enough. And then I thought about this office, this view, this life I had carved out of the ashes of his cruelty. A single thought bloomed in my chest, quiet but powerful. I made it. On my own terms. When I visited my parents that weekend, I told them everything. My father sat back in his worn recliner, a smile tugging at his tired face. You see, Mija? All those years of hard work. This is what it was for. My mother, her eyes glistening, reached across the table and squeezed my hand. And your voice? Don't ever let anyone shame you for it. It carries us. It carries where you come from. I nodded, tears burning in my eyes. For so long, I had carried shame about the very thing that made me different. Now I carried it like a flag. Weeks later, Elaine pulled me aside after a board meeting. You've done well, Isabella. Better than we hoped. The culture is changing. The numbers are strong. And frankly, the clients adore you. Her words filled me with a pride I couldn't fully explain. Not because I needed validation, but because after years of fighting to be seen, I finally was. That night, I wrote one last entry in the same journal where I had once poured out my insecurities. Richard mocked my accent in front of clients. He thought it made me weak, but it made me stronger. It forced me to dig deeper, to fight harder, to stand taller. He lost everything trying to break me, and I gained everything by refusing to break. When I closed the journal, I knew I didn't need to write in it anymore. I didn't need to prove myself to anyone, not even to me, because I had already spoken, loudly,
Clearly.
in my own voice, and they chose me.